The arena was packed from floor to ceiling, every seat filled, every eye pointed down at the center mat. The lights above were so bright they turned the floor almost white. Camera drones buzzed overhead like giant flies, capturing every angle. People had driven hours, flown across states, just to be in that building on that night. Because tonight was not just a show. Tonight was Chuck Norris versus Steven Seagal. The name Chuck Norris alone was enough to make a room go quiet. Decades of fights, decades of movies, decades of a reputation so big it had its own jokes, its own legends. People said Chuck Norris didn't do push-ups. They said he pushed the earth down. That was the kind of man walking into that arena. When he stepped through the entrance, the crowd didn't just cheer, they exploded. The sound bounced off every wall, every rafter, every corner. He walked slowly, taking it all in, soaking it up the way a dry sponge soaks up water. He raised both fists. The crowd got louder. He smiled wide like a man who had never once doubted himself in his entire life. And honestly, why would he? Across the mat, Steven Seagal walked in from the opposite side. No music, no dramatic lighting, no big entrance. He simply appeared, wearing plain, dark training clothes, hands loose at his sides, face completely still. The crowd gave him applause, respectful but nowhere near as loud. Some people in the upper rows were already laughing, nudging each other, because Steven Seagal's fighting style, Aikido, had been the subject of jokes for years. Online videos, comedy sketches, critics calling it fake, calling it soft, calling it something that only worked because the other person let it work. Steven didn't seem to notice any of that. He walked to his side of the mat and stood there, still, calm, like he was waiting for a bus. Chuck walked towards center mat, took the microphone from a stage assistant and turned to face the thousands of people watching him. He looked across at Steven and let out a short laugh, the kind of laugh that says, "I already know how this ends." "Come on," Chuck said, smiling wide. "Aikido?" He shook his head slowly. "You're telling me this is what's going to beat me tonight?" He turned to the crowd and raised his eyebrows. "Aikido!" The crowd laughed with him. Someone in the second row shouted something that got swallowed by the noise, but it sounded like agreement. Chuck was in full performance mode now. He paced back and forth in front of his side of the mat, hands moving as he spoke. He was loose, relaxed, like a comedian on stage who knows exactly which jokes are going to land. "Look," he said, "I've got nothing against the guy, but let's be real. Aikido works great on a movie set." He paused for effect. In a movie set, the other person knows what they're supposed to do next. The laughter came again, even bigger this time. Some people near the front were doubled over. A commentator in the press area said something quietly into his headset and then chuckled. Steven Seagal stood at his side of the mat and watched all of this without a single change in expression. He didn't smile. He didn't look annoyed. He didn't fold his arms defensively. He just waited, hands relaxed, feet slightly apart, eyes steady. Which, to a lot of people, looked like he had nothing to say. Chuck began to mimic Aikido movements, slow, exaggerated, wavy arm circles, the kind of thing people do when they want to make something look ridiculous. The crowd howled. He moved like he was doing a slow dance underwater, rolling his wrists, stepping gently, making soft sounds with his mouth. It was funny. Even people who liked Aikido were laughing a little. A commentator said, "Looks like Steven hasn't moved at all. Maybe he's asleep." That got another wave of laughter from the crowd. Chuck swaggered forward until he was only a few feet from Steven. He looked him up and down the way you'd inspect something you weren't very impressed by. "So, what's the plan tonight?" he asked. "Are you here to throw me or to hypnotize me?" Steven looked at him, not up and down, not with a smirk, just directly, calmly, like a teacher looking at a student who is asked a question he will understand later. He said nothing. That silence made Chuck stand a little taller.
Who actually won this fight? Chuck's power or Steven's silence?
Because silence in front of a crowd feels like weakness. Chuck turned back to the audience and spread his arms open. He doesn't even have an answer. The crowd went wild again. The energy in the arena was enormous. All of it pointed at Chuck, all of it celebrating him. And then Chuck did something that changed the entire night. He reached out and grabbed Steven's wrist. Not gently, firmly, the way someone grabs something they want to control, the way someone proves a point. A few people near the front rows went quiet immediately. A security official behind the barricade shifted his weight forward, suddenly alert. The commentator stopped laughing mid-sentence. Steven looked down at his wrist, then he looked back up at Chuck. His voice was low and very calm, almost gentle, like someone who didn't need to raise his voice because they already knew they were right. "Don't touch me again," Steven said. Chuck blinked, then he laughed. The microphone caught it perfectly, that laugh, and sent it bouncing around the whole arena. "Or what?" Chuck said. Steven turned his wrist, just slightly, a tiny movement barely visible to most people in the stands. But Chuck felt something in that instant that he wasn't expecting. Not pain, nothing violent, just a shift, a feeling like the ground under his feet had become slightly less certain. He let go without fully realizing he was letting go. The crowd didn't notice that part. They were still laughing, but the people closest to the mat, the security team, the referees, a few sharp-eyed fighters seated in the front rows, they noticed. They leaned forward just a little. Chuck covered it fast. He stepped back a half pace, shook his hand casually like he'd just released his grip on purpose, and smiled at the audience. "Nice try," he said loudly. Steven didn't respond to that. He simply let his wrist fall back to his side, fingers loose, his posture the same as before, like nothing had happened at all, which in a way was the most unsettling response he could have given. Chuck paced again, but this time the pacing was different, slightly less relaxed. His eyes flicked back to Steven between sentences. "You know what your whole style is built on," he said to the crowd more than to Steven. "It's built on the other person being cooperative." He held up a finger. "One condition. The other guy has to go along with it." He pointed at Steven. "And I'm not going along with anything tonight." Steven nodded once slowly. "That's fine," he said quietly. "I don't need you to cooperate. I just need you to move." That stopped the laughter. Not all at once, but like a fire running out of air. It faded fast. A few people in the stands looked at each other. Chuck felt it too. He tilted his head slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Steven didn't explain. He took one slow step forward. Just one, unhurried, completely relaxed. Chuck held his ground, but something in his chest tightened just a little, the way it tightens when the animal part of your brain registers something your eyes haven't understood yet. Chuck lifted his hands loosely in front of him. Not a full fighting stance, not yet, but getting there. "Real quick," he said. "Speed that fast doesn't care about balance." Steven answered him softly. "Speed without a foundation is just falling in a hurry." The commentator murmured into his headset. "I don't know what's happening here exactly, but the energy just shifted completely." He was right. The arena was quieter now. The laughter was gone. The phones that had been pointed at Chuck in celebration were now pointed at both men, recording, because people could feel it. Not danger exactly, something harder to name. The feeling you get right before something unexpected happens, the moment before the surprise. Chuck decided to end the talking. He stepped in with a quick jab, not his hardest, a test strike, the kind of hit you use to measure someone. It snapped toward Steven's shoulder fast and clean. Steven moved his weight just slightly, less than an inch to the side. The punch missed his shoulder by the thinnest margin. To most of the crowd, it looked like luck, or like Chuck had pulled it on purpose. But Chuck knew exactly where his fist had aimed, and it had hit nothing. Chuck reset, stepping back into position. "See," he announced to the crowd, "that could have landed any time I wanted." Steven didn't argue. He simply took one small step to the left, hands still open at his sides, the kind of step that somehow didn't look like stepping away. It looked more like settling in.
Chuck tried again, faster this time. A combination, 2 strikes in quick succession, and a step met to crowd Steven's space and take his ground away from him. It was a solid approach, textbook pressure fighting. The kind of attack that worked against almost everyone because almost everyone responded by backing up, and backing up put you at a disadvantage fast. Stephen didn't back up. He moved forward and sideways at the same time. It was so small, so smooth, that half the arena didn't even catch it at first. His left hand brushed Chuck's wrist during the first strike. Not a block, not a grab, just a touch, like redirecting the ball rolling across a table. Chuck's first strike skimmed past empty air. His second strike, following the first, arrived at an angle where Stevens simply wasn't standing anymore. Both punches landed on nothing. Chuck pulled back and exhaled sharply. The commentator said, very quietly, "Did he even move? I can barely tell." Someone in the crowd said loudly, "What is happening?" Chuck's jaw tightened. He was not a man who lost his composure easily. 30-plus years of fighting had built a foundation in him that almost nothing could shake. But something was getting under his skin now. Not anger exactly, something more uncomfortable. He felt like he was fighting a room he couldn't get a grip on, like trying to grab smoke. "You keep moving into my attacks," Chuck said, and his voice had lost some of its performance edge. "Most people trying to survive would be running backward right now." Stephen replied, "Running backward doesn't end anything. It just makes you tired in a different direction." Chuck stared at him. Then he moved in hard, really committing this time, grabbing Stephen's arm with both hands and pulling with real force. A dominant move, physical, aggressive, designed to drag a person off balance and expose them. The crowd jumped to their feet at the sudden contact. Stephen's foot pivoted. One foot, a small rotation of his hips, that was all. Chuck pulled and felt something go wrong immediately. Instead of Stephen being yanked forward, Chuck's own weight seemed to rush past him. He felt his own pull turning against him, like leaning into a door that suddenly opened the wrong way. His feet scrambled to keep him upright. He managed it, barely, but the effort showed clearly to anyone watching. He released Stephen's arm and stepped back. The hand he'd been pulling with felt strange, not injured, just wrong, like a vibration that hadn't stopped yet. He shook his fingers out, making it look casual. "Enough warming up," he announced. "Now we actually go." Stephen straightened fully, his hands opened at his sides. His voice was very quiet. "I was hoping you'd say that." The entire arena seemed to inhale at once. Chuck dropped into a real stance now, not a performance, not a show. Everything casual and loose was gone. He was a fighter, a real one, and everyone watching knew what that looked like when it was turned on completely. His eyes locked onto Stephen with a sharp, particular focus, the kind that didn't miss anything. Stephen didn't mirror him. He just stood there, open hands, relaxed knees, breathing easy, like he was standing in a garden. The space between them hummed. Chuck launched, full speed, full commitment, a driving straight punch aimed directly at Stephen's center, followed immediately by a hard lateral step designed to crowd the space and take away every option. It was the combination of a man who had knocked people out with it before, a combination that ended fights. Stephen walked into it. That's the only way to describe what happened next. While Chuck drove forward, Stephen stepped forward and sideways at the same time, rotating at the hips, and the punch that was aimed at his chest arrived just as Stephen had already turned away from it. Stephen's left hand found Chuck's wrist at the perfect moment, not to stop it, just to touch it, just to give it a direction. His right hand slid to the inside of Chuck's elbow. Chuck felt the floor shift beneath him, not because of anything Stephen was forcing, because of everything Chuck had built up himself. All that forward momentum, all that committed power now had nowhere to go except in the direction Stephen had quietly suggested with his two hands in one small turn. Chuck tried to pull back. That made it faster. Stephen rotated, smooth as a wheel turning, and guided the arm in a long, slow arc downward and forward. His own body barely moved at all. It looked from the stands like he had simply stepped to the side and waited. The throw wasn't a slam. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't look like the kind of thing you'd see in an action movie. There was no jump, no shout, no tremendous display of strength. Chuck Norris went to the mat flat on his back, and the sound of him landing echoed through the entire arena like a single drumbeat in a silent room. Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything. For a full 3 seconds, the entire arena, thousands of people, sat in complete silence. Stephen stood above him, still holding the arm, not twisting it, not damaging it, just holding it. His posture was relaxed. His breathing was the same as when he had walked in, like none of this had cost him anything at all. He let go immediately, stepped back, gave space. No follow-up, no posturing, no raised fist, no looking at the crowd, just stillness. Chuck lay on the mat and stared straight up at the lights overhead. His chest was rising and falling fast. He blinked. He moved his fingers, rotated his shoulder, flexed his wrist. Everything worked. Nothing was hurt. He was completely fine physically. That somehow made it harder to process. He pushed himself up slowly to one elbow, then to sitting, then to standing. His face was different now. The performance was completely gone. What was left was real. A fighter looking at another fighter and understanding something new. He looked at Stephen. Stephen looked back at him with the same calm expression he had worn the entire night, the expression that had never changed once, not when the crowd laughed, not when Chuck mocked him, not when he was grabbed, not when he was shoved, not now. Chuck looked down at the mat. He looked at his own hand. He looked back up. "You didn't push," Chuck said slowly. His voice was no longer performing. It was just talking. "You didn't force anything." Stephen shook his head. "I didn't need to." The silence broke. The arena erupted, not in the same way as when Chuck had entered, not in the kind of loud celebration that comes with dominance. This was something different. This was the sound of thousands of people exhaling and then cheering because they had just watched something they had not expected, something that quietly rearranged the way they understood what strength looked like. A commentator was shouting now. He used Chuck's own momentum. Chuck threw himself. He literally used everything Chuck gave him. Coaches in the crowd were already leaning over to the people next to them, pointing, explaining. Fighters were rewinding the clip on their phones, even though it happened 15 seconds ago. Chuck stood in the center of the mat and looked out at the audience and then back at Stephen. "I came here tonight thinking I was going to prove something," he said to the crowd. He looked at the mat. "I did prove something." He looked back at the audience. "I proved I still had something to learn." The crowd responded with noise that seemed to go up instead of out, rising toward the ceiling. Stephen took the microphone when Chuck offered it. He held it loosely. His voice was unhurried, the way it had been all night. "A lot of people doubt what they don't understand. That's normal. Understanding takes time." He paused. "But force doesn't wait for understanding. It just arrives, and when it does, you either know what to do with it or you don't." He handed the microphone back without ceremony. Chuck looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something that made the entire arena go quiet for the second time that night. He bowed, not dramatically, not for the cameras, a real bow, small, deliberate, completely sincere. Stephen returned it without hesitation. In that small exchange between two bows, something settled in the room. Not a winner, not a loser. Two people who had started the night on opposite sides of an argument and finished it standing on the same ground. The clips were everywhere before the arena lights had even come back up, slowed down, frame by frame, analyzed, dated. People who had never watched a martial arts video in their life were watching the throw on a loop, trying to figure out exactly what had happened and when. Because from most angles, it looked like Stephen had barely done anything. A step, a touch, a turn, and Chuck Norris had hit the mat. In an interview later that evening, Chuck didn't deflect it. He didn't joke it away. "I went in thinking I already had the answer," he said simply. He paused. "The best lessons always start that way." Stephen gave one comment when asked. It was short. "Technique matters, but knowing when to use nothing at all matters more." People would argue about the details for weeks. Was it real? Was it staged? Was it luck? Fighters broke down the footwork. Coaches used it in lessons. Online threads filled with opinions and counter-opinions. But underneath it all, past all the debate, one thing sat quietly that nobody could argue with. The man with the loudest entrance gone to the mat. The man who had said nothing, done almost nothing, and needed almost nothing, had placed him there. And when it was over, there were no excuses, no anger, just two men standing together, and between them, a lesson that didn't need a single word to explain itself.
because the most powerful thing in that arena all night had never raised its voice once.